Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thanks a lot for being here with us. Really appreciate your time. The topic I'm going to talk about today is this whole notion of return on information. A lot of folks that have gone behind me, talked about the social revolution that's taking place, talked about BYOD, talked about the number of text messages, emails, and all of that kind of thing. And at the end of the day, the one manifestation of all of that is information, which has to be managed, which has to be secured, which has to be governed, retained. There was an interesting statistic I heard at Gartner a couple of years ago. Any corporation that goes through data loss, complete data loss, without any good disaster recovery plan, tends to go out of business within the next 5 years. That's a pretty compelling statistic, right? Tends to literally go out of business within the next 5 years. That just goes to show how critical this whole paradigm of information management is. And now we're taking it to the next level, which is, hey, what is the point of having all of this information if you can't gain any insights out of it? There is literally no point of storing all of that data. Yeah, there's retention, there's governance and pieces like that. But unless you can really take that data and use it meaningfully to drive business results, to drive business decisions, what is the point of collecting all of that information? That's exactly what I'm going to talk about. If I can get the slides moving. There you go. All right. A lot of folks talked about these notions. I'm not going to go over all of them. But the fact is, in a market like India, you guys are focused on unprecedented growth. Now, last year, I did a similar session on storage in general at the same conference in Dubai. I don't know how many of you were there. But one of the things I asked the audience to raise their hands on was, how many of you folks are experiencing double-digit or even doubling your storage growth within the next 1 or 2 years? And it was literally 70% of the crowd that raised their hands. And then I asked the question, how many of you are doubling your budget in the next 1 to 2 years? There was 0 hands. I'm presuming that paradigm is still absolutely in place, right? So the big challenge is, for the folks who are really challenged with growth, how do you manage all of that growth, save that information, derive insights out of it, keeping your budget literally flat or minute amount of growth in your budget? Convergence, Phil talked a little about convergence. It's a pretty neat concept where basically now you're taking compute, fabric, and store and saying all of this is computing from a true operational standpoint. So to manage it as 3 separate buckets is honestly crazy today's context. Managing that whole piece is where the industry is shifting. Virtualization and cloud, you guys are very familiar with that one. Unprecedented utilization through some of that, unprecedented time to market through some of those technologies. Connected devices, BYOD, bring your own device. I'm sure all of you have felt it. The first person to ever bring a non-supported device in your environment, I'm sure, was the CEO, right? He's the person or she's the person who walked in with that non-supported device. And then finally, the topic I'm going to talk about, which is this data explosion, right? The ability to manage first this data and then gain insights out of it is absolutely key. One thing I'll say, if there's one thing I'll ask you to remember from this entire presentation, is the fact that there's a lot of misnomers about big data. I've talked to customers globally for the last year or two talking about these notions. And, the first thing a lot of customers tend to think is big data is a repository. And it's not. I can tell you, if you manage big data as a repository, you have failed. You have failed to get actionable insights, which is the whole reason you want to have big data in your environment, right? The second big misnomer is big data is for big corporations. Absolutely untrue. Any corporation of any size absolutely requires the ability to mine their information, analyze it, and then use it, whether it be predictive analysis or whatever they use it for. Business decisions, all of those pieces. So those are the two key things. Do not treat big data as a separate repository, because what you're doing is you're perpetuating your current storage problems that you have. You are going to create an independent silo where all of this information lies, and that information is not going to talk across the board. And then, bear in mind, big data is not necessarily for a big corporation only. Absolutely any corporation of any size can avail of this technology and can avail of the benefits of this technology. The bottom line, though, is before thinking big data, before getting into big data and the insights, you have to have the right data management system in place. If you set up your data as repositories, it would be next to impossible without replicating absolutely everything to get to the place where you can get your insights. And that's where we believe Dell has a really strong state. That is the notion we entered the market with from a storage standpoint. The fluid data architecture is absolutely built on the premise that we understand, on the top, take storage and virtualization and consolidation, extend virtualization, extend all the values and benefits of virtualization from compute to the storage, right? Application optimization, absolutely key. You will be amazed, and I'll talk about it in the next slide, how much storage affects application performance. And then you've got the whole notion of data protection, disaster recovery, and the whole governance and retention piece. Now, all of that has to have a very strong foundation. And that foundation has to cut across any medium of storage that you have, whether it be a production data, whether it be a backup, tier 2, tier 3, whether it be archive, or whether it be storage in the cloud. I'm sure some of you are actually thinking about moving storage to the cloud on some applications. HR systems, learning and development, pieces like that, right? But you're definitely not talking about moving storage to the cloud when it comes to your ERP application or something like that. What's the point of having these in different sources if they cannot talk to each other and they cannot gel? Think about how difficult it is to get insights from two completely separate repositories. Being able to connect that information, analyze it from two different sources, and then port out the results. Next to impossible, in all honesty. It's difficult. It's costly. It's complex. You require a lot of resources that you might not have the budget to sustain. And that's where we come in, honestly, from the data management aspect. The primary storage, based on our compellent, EqualLogic, PowerVault system sets up that core base of production. Then, you move into the application server side. Now we've got fluid cache and application servers. The recent testing that we did basically showed you could take a basic application like Oracle or SQL and improve performance up to 300x through the fluid cache tier. I mean, you're not talking about a fluid cache tier, which is MBs or GBs. You're talking about terabytes. You're talking about terabytes. So imagine the information that has been most recently accessed, or the information you require the most, living absolutely as close to the compute as physically possible. You cannot imagine performance better than that. And that's the fluid cache tier. One of the slides on yesterday's presentation talked about the traditional file system is dead. That is absolutely accurate. The traditional file system is completely dead. Object-based storage is a much more powerful concept around, massive file repositories. And then finally, the cloud-based storage. What information can you potentially move to the cloud? So I'll leave this part of the conversation saying, we do have a comprehensive end-to-end portfolio. And the beauty of the portfolio is we do not sell it to you in repositories. We absolutely do not sell it to you in repositories where gathering insights is going to be next to impossible. Now, let's talk about big data a little. What do customers, the customers that we talk to, what are they looking for? First of all, cost-efficient data analytics, right? But that is challenging. Data analytics is challenging because it is going to put more burden on your IT budget. It's a net new investment you're going to have to make. Second thing is ease of deployment. That becomes key. Back to your IT budget. How many of you have the budget to go hire 5, 2, 3, 5, 10 more people who have the skill set around generating complex data warehousing solutions and the analytics? You don't. If I ask people to raise their hands, minute few would raise their hands. The fact is you need something that is simple and intuitive, right? Data agnostic solutions, that is a key one. Irrespective of what medium the data lies in, irrespective of where the data lies, all of you would want a solution that cuts across all of those barriers and can generate that information seamlessly. Pretty obvious choice. It is the holy grail in storage, right? Because not a single vendor writes to the same metadata. It is the holy grail of storage. And then finally, scalable architectures, right? Scale out. The whole notion of pay as you grow, demand-based, cost models, and all of those things, they're only possible when you get to that scale-out architecture strategy. And the issue is, I'm sure a lot of you have proprietary systems today that require a ton of translation, which requires a ton of specialized resources or consulting services, which eventually puts more pressure on your IT budget, right? So these are most of the conversations. This is most of the feedback we get from our customers when we talk about the whole notion of analytics, big data, and pieces like that. Well, so here's what I would throw to you. A lot of folks come to me and say, hey, my CEO really loves this whole notion of predictive analysis and big data and things like that. How do I go empower that? Well, the first thing you've got to do is, where are you in this stage? And there's so many customers I talk to. It is a journey. It is absolutely a journey. It is not a starting and end point. It is a journey you have to go through to make sure you have the systems in place that support that eventual goal of the promise that big data gives to you. It starts off at the most basic level, which is casual data access and analyses. I can guarantee you, if I ask the question, how many of you had the ability to basically, tell how many products your corporation or your company sells? Absolutely everybody would. How do you track it? Excel and other places, right? That's probably not a problem. Then you get to the information consolidation layer, right? How many sales reps sell product X versus product Y? What's your mix look like? Again, most of you have that information readily available. It's in your databases, it's an easy pull, and you can get to that information pretty fast. Again, it's more Excel-based, right? Now it starts getting interesting. Proactive reporting. How many of you can say, how many products have you sold in a certain country, in a certain county, in a certain state, in a certain district, and things like that, right? That granularity level of reporting, right? That starts getting complicated now. I'll ask the question, some of you will raise your hand, some of you won't. You don't get there, right? The next is true predictive analysis. Monsoons. What kind of an impact will it have on your sales next year? Do you have a historical trend, of how monsoons affected your buying season? And can you predict next year or the year after what that trending looks like, depending upon what the forecasts are? Probably not a lot of you would have, that level of predictive analysis in place. When you've done all of that and you've got your systems placed so that you can get to that point, that's the point in time you start really talking about big data, right? Unless you have these steps in place, and I'm willing to bet most of you have steps 1, 2, and 3 in place. 4 gets a little tricky. 5 gets very tricky. Because you can't get to that paradigm You don't have access to all of the queries that are required. You don't have access to a database that singularly presents that information in front of you. And that's the way you have to think about big data. It's not as easy as saying, I want big data. It's a journey you have to go through. It's a journey that you have to self-realize where you are and then make a decision based on that in terms of what your investment profile is going to look like to get you to that ultimate state of being able to tell, why is product X more popular in this market with this certain set of people? And what can I do from a business decision standpoint to start affecting that, to make my P&L look better? So Dell's end-to-end approach for big data, this is what it looks like. It's a complicated chart, but it is a complicated topic at the end of the day, right? When data comes through, what we go through is this whole process. First of all, storing the data is absolutely paramount. The storing of the data is paramount because that sets up the repository for you to manage all of this information and extract insights out of it. And that's the data management solutions that I walked through. Make sure you have the right data management solutions to be able to start the first step of the analytics. The second is integration, right? And when I say integration, I'm not only talking about the cloud. The cloud, maybe most of you have not even invested in cloud from a storage standpoint. I'm talking about integration across your different tiers of storage. Tier 1, Tier 2, archive, and all of those. That's the second piece, right, which is absolutely critical to be able to get to that point. The third piece is protection. You have to be able to protect that data at all times. Back to that statistic. The likelihood of a company going out of business within 5 years of having a disaster occur where they lost their information is extremely high. Protection is absolutely key. And then you come to that final part, which is the analysis part, right? Set up the data warehouse and put your analytics behind it so that you can predict and you can make a veil of that trend that's going on. Let's talk about solutions for a second. We absolutely have a very comprehensive list of all the solutions that we offer in this space. From a data warehousing perspective, it can range depending upon what customers like. Are you a self-builder? Do you have the IT resources to build a lot of these repositories, these databases, and to query on your own? Excuse me, we absolutely have that. Do you want an appliance model where it's intuitive? A storage administrator could manage this for you. Hell, a network administrator could probably manage this for you, right? Where you have very low effort to build yourself, you have capacity, for smaller organizations. Query complexity is medium, right? And that's based on this whole SQL quick start database. Then you get into more larger capacities, larger repositories with the SQL Fast Track, right? Much larger capacity, goes from anywhere between 2 terabytes and 20 terabytes. It is moderately difficult to build because you're talking about customization. It is not a pure appliance model, right? You are talking about some degree of customization. Query complexity is still medium because you need a person who understands the SQL database and who can code in the SQL database. It's not English, right? It's not as simple as English, at least, right? And then finally, the whole parallel data warehouse appliance. Much, much larger data requirements, scales up to 600 terabytes. Low effort to build because, again, highly appliance-centric model, plug and play. Plug and play. However, query complexity, very high. Absolutely need coders who understand parallel data warehousing, write queries in it, and extract the right information. In all honesty, in a lot of those cases, it's not just the person writing the queries. It's also the person defining what do you want to query. That becomes pretty tricky. Because a lot of people don't get what do they want. What can they use that can drive the right business decisions, right? So a long range of data warehousing solutions. Let's talk about analytics. How many of you have heard of SAP HANA? Quite a few of you. We were one of the first partners with SAP to launch this in a pure appliance-based model. We've got a ton of flavors. Take your data warehouse and now apply the analytics behind it. I'll talk about a customer case study where we got some incredible results using SAP HANA. I won't go through the details of the configuration and things like that, but know that there are extensive solutions that cover right from, the smaller end requirements around analytics and repositories, and it's let's face it, analytics is entirely dependent upon the size of the database and the amount of querying you're going to do to it, right? That's what you determine your capacity and everything by. And then finally, I don't know how many people have heard of Hadoop, a database that's becoming incredibly popular now. Admittedly, much larger size. A lot of corporations can make it easier with the right consulting services, but before you jump into something like Hadoop, right, you have to make sure you have the requirement for it. Because it's not by any means an inexpensive solution. It's not by any means a simplistic, intuitive solution, right? It is a very targeted application for very specific requirements around the whole analytics piece, right? And Dell, we partner pretty well with a company called Cloudera, to provide a bunch of services. Now, the neat thing about this whole thing is, you remember the last point I talked about, which was one of the things that holds you back is the whole notion of proprietary systems, is the fact that, if you build it on proprietary systems, it is really difficult to translate that information. Well, all of the solutions that I talked about end-to-end from Dell are absolutely all based on industry-standard architectures. So if you have Microsoft managing that entire environment, if you have a heavy dose of virtualization built in with VMware, and you have vCenter, that integration between all of those tiers and all of these vectors still absolutely holds true, because it is based on industry standard architecture, right? Let's talk about the customer example. University of Kentucky, and I'll be the first to admit, this is a comparatively new practice, right? We're seeing a lot of customers barely start dipping their toes in this arena. Because in all honesty, half of them, it's the age-old question of storage, right? How do you reduce the amount of storage when you don't even know where storage lives? If I was to ask absolutely everybody in this room, tell me exactly where any and all aspects of your storage live, right from what is native to the servers, what's on consolidated storage, what's on block, what's on file, what's on archive, what's on backup, very few people will be able to precisely answer that, right? Big data is no different from its evolution. A lot of people are barely dipping their toes. But this one example, Vince Keller, who is the CIO of University of Kentucky, basically they were faced with a challenge. The challenge was, how do I get to a point where I can actually see how my students are performing and proactively provide them education services so that I could help them graduate? One of the biggest problems they were facing was only 60 to 70% of their class sizes were graduating. And when they found out there was a problem, it was too late to fix. And people required 5 years and 6 years to graduate. So Vince put this system in place based on SAP HANA with Dell, right? And it's a predictive analysis which looks at student records, which looks at, how students are progressing, and then makes a very intelligent call on where exactly these students require the most help. And based on that, the counselors then talk to the students and get them classes or get them projects which is outside their natural course of work. And they saw graduation rates go up drastically. So it's a phenomenal example of where one corporation understood what they wanted to query, how they wanted to use it, and then put it in real-life practice. Vince talks about this across the U.S. all the time. And these solutions now, excuse me, are in front of some of the biggest and best colleges in the U.S. as a best practice to apply in their own infrastructures, right? So this is a great example, you know. It's an education example. I get it. Not all of you are from education, but it's very portable. It's extremely portable. If you folks work for an organization that has sales reps, you could do absolutely the same thing with sales reps to understand what are their weak points. What are the accounts that they find most difficult to crack into? Is it an acquisition account? Is it a retention account? Is it a development account? And then prescriptively do learning and development based on that to provide a better P&L for the company, right? The last piece I want to, you think about is the fact that, we talked about the whole notion of big data, laying out the infrastructure that supports big data, the data management solutions and all of that. And I would argue Dell is absolutely a leader in this space. We started investing in this space 4 to 5 years ago with the acquisition of EqualLogic. We've made recurrent acquisitions that have absolutely kept hold the true of the fluid data concept, that data does not have to reside in repositories. Some of the net benefits on Compellent, we did a 5-year study on Compellent, and for an average Compellent customer, their storage costs went down. Actually, it was a 3-year study. Their storage costs went down by 80% over 3 years, utilizing a technology like Compellent. We did the same on EqualLogic. In its category, EqualLogic was more cost-effective than absolutely any other platform, whether it be NetApp, whether it be EMC, whether it be Hitachi, irrespective. In its category, it was the most cost-effective platform because it married the concepts and it embraced the concepts of virtualization and the high utilization and the ability to move data seamlessly without having a $150,000, storage administrator managing it to the very last detail. They provide you greater flexibility. We talked about the fact that moving data seamlessly among your tiers gives you that flexibility, opens up, production for you so that you're not constantly buying more and more and more disk, right? And uptime. And I'll leave you in this. Don't think of uptime, like challenge your current vendors. A lot of people think about uptime as when the array is up and running. That's not the concept of uptime only. What about when you have to do a forklift upgrade and you have to take your entire system down, get in the new system, get in the new flash, and upgrade the whole thing? Do you not consider that downtime? Absolutely. So over the array, over the lifetime of the arrays that you have, the notion of uptime, on the 99,999, the 5 nines notion of uptime, should last through that cycle. And that's one of the things with no forklift upgrades and seamless porting over to the next generation. That's something we can offer you through EqualLogic and Compellent. That's it for me, folks. Thanks a lot for your time. Thank you.